everyone. I'm Tamara Banks. It's great to be with you here, Mitch, on Dialogue Denver DA.
Tamara, how are you?
Great, great. And we welcome our guest, Gregg LaBerge.
Hello.
Hello.
It's nice to be here.
I always hesitate when I say that name, that last name. Thanks so much for being here. And we're here to talk about your trip to Costa Rica, but not a vacation trip, really a working trip centered around DNA. How did that trip come about, Mitch? I'll start with you.
Well, we had some people come to Denver from Trinidad and Tobago, and they took a tour of the crime lab. And Gregg called me and said, "Hey, I want you to meet these folks." And so we sat down, and there were a couple of people from the State Department with them. And they started talking about the need for training in that part of the world. And we had done a training in Abu Dhabi for years. We used to go around throughout the United States doing training for law enforcement, for judges, for lawyers. So we kind of have that in place. And so I mentioned that to them, and they were interested, and then called and invited us down there. The one piece that they said they needed and we needed to add was a judge. And so we added Judge Reinstein from Arizona. He's a retired judge that knows a lot about forensics. And so the three of us went down there. That's kind of how it worked out.
And so I understand that the U.S. Embassy and the State Department have an interest in putting this all together. Why is that?
Well, Gregg's worked extensively with the State Department in Europe. They weren't involved in the Abu Dhabi trip. That was actually just the United Emirates that had us there. But the State Department does a lot around forensics. If you think about it, Costa Rica is a place a lot of American and Canadian tourists go. We have an interest there that it is a safe place for people to go and have vacations, that type of thing. So clearly the embassy is concerned about crime, but also the State Department is concerned about it. And since the United States is really a leader in a lot of the different forensic technologies, Canada as well, when it comes to ballistics, they donate a lot of equipment to that part of the world, a lot of the databases, those types of things. So I think it's just kind of the natural follow-up of that to have this kind of training.
Do they have fingerprint and ballistics and DNA databases already in place, or did you help sort of put that together with them?
They have those capabilities, but the databases are rather recent. So the Canadian government donated some equipment, about $1.2 million worth of equipment, to establish a ballistics database because of the level of gun crime across Costa Rica. So the Canadian government put that in, and we saw that on our tour of the lab. They also have the APHIS database for fingerprints that's been in place for several years, about 5 years now. And they also have just recently, within the last year and a half, put in the CODIS, which is DNA database that the FBI and the State Department sponsored them to start working with. So they've got the three major databanks, but they're still building infrastructure around how to use those databanks and how to best implement them throughout the country. So that's really what we were doing, was to train them on the legal aspects of that and then how to use that in their criminal justice system.
Do they have a relatively high crime rate? Is that part of the reason that you're engaged?
Actually, they do. They have a pretty high crime rate. It's not well publicized, and it's in pockets around the country, in certain areas, typically not in the tourist areas, but in coastal areas and also in San Juan, the major city there. So there are some issues that they're facing, specifically drug trafficking coming through from Colombia, from South America, and coming up through Panama and through Costa Rica up to Nicaragua. There are pretty major issues around drug trafficking. So the United States government is obviously interested in interdicting that and improving the conditions that their law enforcement have to do something about it.
We were surprised at their homicide rate. It is, you know, it's a country of about 4 million, 5 million people, and they were, a couple of years ago, had a homicide rate of about 500, over 500 homicides, murders. And then we did hear about their sexual assault rate, and these are the sciences that help you catch murderers and rapists, and they do have a real problem there. The good news is that for Central America, they have the lowest crime rate, but it's still, it's unacceptable, and they think it's unacceptable, and so we were down there trying to help them.
And even though the crime rate is relatively low, as you said, in the tourist areas, it still sort of bleeds into the tourist areas. And I'm sure those folks are grateful for the work that you're doing there.
Yeah, a lot of pickpocketing and thieves and robbery type things in the tourist areas. But the violent crimes that we're talking about, we didn't see, for instance, statistics that a lot of American women were being sexually assaulted. That was a low number. But they have a lot of sex assaults. And so obviously we were down there talking about forensics, but primarily forensic DNA. And DNA helps you solve sex assaults against women and children. So that's primarily what they were focused on. But it really wasn't training their forensic scientists. It was more about the people in the criminal justice system and how do you use this, how do you rely on it, is it something you can rely on? Gregg did an incredible presentation one afternoon on mixtures that we always see in DNA, but that's something that's extremely important and sometimes hard to understand. It was very well received.
It sounds like they were willing to accept some of the information you were working with them. Sometimes that's hard to translate, not just culturally, but just to get people on board with the 21st century kind of science.
It's interesting when you work internationally. I have a lot of experience in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, and when you first go into these places, there's some national pride that occurs, and so when you start describing what you're going to be covering and talking about the plan for, say, the week or 2 weeks, initially you get a sense that actually they know everything I'm going to tell them. That's the sense you get. But after you dig in a little bit and ask some key questions, you find out that actually they really don't know it, but they have a level of pride where they don't want to appear like they don't know it.
Right.
So getting through some of that is a challenge in the first couple of days of any program. But I think that once we got past that and got into the detail and started asking those key questions, we were able to address some pretty big gaps or deficiencies. And actually, what resulted from that, or what's going to result from that, is a pretty good look at their laboratory system. They have a very advanced laboratory for the region, but they're trying to get to the same level that our lab here in Denver is at, called ISO 17025, which is an international operating standard, and they have quite a bit to go to reach that standard. So hopefully we'll play a role with them in the future at getting there. And that's what I do with the State Department in Eastern Europe as an extra job on the side to what I do here.
Well, in those trainings, particularly one in Costa Rica, who's all involved? Is it everybody from the police officers to the judges and everyone in between, or just sort of particular?
Well, it's interesting because they have kind of a different system there. The prosecutors take over control of the crime scene and the investigation. So there were some investigators there. There were a lot of prosecutors there. There were some defense attorneys there, and there were judges there. And then there was a second group that came in for a half day that were all from their criminal side of their Supreme Court, who more the philosophical kind of privacy type concerns that they have at that level. So it was actually two different groups. But they have judges, for instance, that go to crime scenes and kind of oversee things, which we don't have here. And then at a certain point they become trial judges and they move up through a system that's a little bit different than the system that we have here. So we had to adapt some of the things that we do. But the nice thing about it was, like Gregg mentioned, they have a strong forensic lab there. And their lab had a presence in our training. And Gregg always gives me a hard time because I'm kind of the person that pushes for the crime lab tour. But we learned a long time ago doing these presentations to law enforcement, to lawyers, to give them some hands-on experience. We learned that in the United States in the 5 years we were doing it in the Rocky Mountain region. We went from Kansas to Oklahoma, North and South Dakota. And we always had a lab part of it where we actually took them into a lab and they actually did some processing so they understood why it took so long, why it worked, how it worked. So we weren't able to do that here, but we were able to get them to their lab and to take a tour. And because they were from a province that was pretty far away from the main city, the capital city, they weren't going to get that opportunity. And I think that that really did assist us. And Gregg always pushes really hard for the local lab to play a role in what we're doing. So we're not saying things that they can't do, and we're not beyond where they are in advancement. And I think that actually see the lab for the lawyers and the judges, I think that was real important.
It's important that we bring the awareness to them, but then that their laboratory and their laboratory personnel pick that up from where we left off, and they're the source. They're the source of the information for those prosecutors and defense attorneys in their Supreme Court. So it's really good to have their lab as the focus. So we're more about the facilitators, and then we come back to the United States. So we can't be advertising things that is not possible in their country. So it's really important to have that partnership. And we're mentoring them. And then basically it will be an ongoing thing. And typically what happens in these countries, like in Ukraine, is you can get one of the countries to be a leader in the region, and then they can mentor the other countries that are in their circle. And that's what's happening in Ukraine. Ukraine is now a leader in the former Soviet republics, and the other ones are looking to them for leadership, which means that our mission there was successful.
And I think that's kind of the goal, it looked like, of the State Department, is to really set Costa Rica up to be the leader in that area. They've been in democracy for a long time. They've had a stable government for a long time. Some of the other places that have had revolutions, those types of things. So it's kind of where they are trying to establish them with all of the databases that we talked about. They virtually got those things for free from the United States and from Canada because they trusted them to put them in place. And then from there springboard into the neighbors of Costa Rica around in Central America that have a little bit, one, higher crime rate, and two, they've had problems over the course of the last 15, 20, 30 years.
Can you measure how better investigations have become because of the work that you've done, and whether it's the Ukraine, Costa Rica is too soon to say at this point, but is there a tool that we can measure that yet?
Well, on the work I've done in Ukraine, one of the things that I do is I evaluate data from cases. So they send me the data over here with email, and I review the data and then give them a report back on the quality of the data and how it needs to improve. And I give them assignments, actually. So I won't just travel there just to travel there. I actually give them a set of assignments and then say, complete these, send me the data, and then I'll review it, and then I'll travel there to go over it in person and work with you for implementation. So in Ukraine, when I got there in 2009, their data was really questionable. They were doing some science that was really on the edge of not being valid. It was really not valid. And the last trip there I made was last November, and the data quality was on par with what we have here. So that was a great improvement. And just seeing that transition and getting the understanding, and we actually brought one of their scientists over here for 2 months to have a visiting scientist program that was paid for by the State Department, to have their best young person come here and learn from our people and then go back and implement what he learned. And he did a pretty good job. He could have done a little better. Yeah. And I'm going to go back sometime next year to follow up. But that's what it takes, is a year gap or 6 months, and then do the follow-up and stay on it.
Right.
To be sure that it gets implemented, so it's not a waste of everybody's time and money.
Right.
And you know, the thing that we did, it was pretty clear that most of the folks were from Limon,
on the Atlantic coast.
And so they knew each other, and they also were from an area where there is a lot of drug trafficking. And so issues of safety, those types of things. And so they kind of were a pretty good group as far as they knew each other or knew of each other. But they didn't seem to know the lab people. And so we established those relationships. And so they could call somebody that they sat in the conference with or they took a tour of the lab with. And that will help them then if they have issues of understanding, you know, a complex DNA mixture, numbers, those kinds of things. The kinds of things that we do, we kind of take for granted. My people are over at the crime lab asking questions, preparing, you know, for filing or for trial. Are we going to file this case? What do we really have? That kind of thing. That's commonplace for us. But it was pretty clear that they didn't have that relationship built. So to have them come to see the lab, to hear us talk, and build those relationships. And Gregg built a relationship with the lab director, In fact, there was probably some photographs, I know they're going to show some, of the two of them talking, and he did some presentations. And I think that when he can lean on Gregg then for help, as far as his ISO accreditation, that type of thing. So those kind of relationships do help. And we don't know if the State Department will be interested in follow-up, but they did talk to us in kind of a debriefing phone call and said that things went really well. It was well received, and they'd like to have us back maybe in a different region or with a different region come in. And then, of course, I think there's some idea that they might have us go to a few countries, other countries in the region.
Did you get a chance to tour the National Forensic Crime Lab?
We did. One afternoon we were able to arrange it. It was kind of disappointing because we were going down there during the federal government's they were shut down.
Oh, yeah.
And so when we told them this is incredibly important, we think, they said, well, you know, we're not even coming, which they didn't, because of the government was closed. But they also said, that would be just too much of a hassle to arrange. When we got down there on Sunday, we met with a young woman from the embassy. We mentioned it to her. She was phenomenal. She said, we'll get this done. And on Wednesday afternoon, she said, listen, let's talk to the lab director tomorrow, which we did, and he was, again, that national pride. He was more than happy to bring people into the lab. And then there was somebody from the Judicial College who had a van. So by Wednesday, we had it all set up, and it went off. Everybody got there. I think we got back in the van when the big rainstorm happened, so we didn't even get soaking wet like every afternoon if you were outside. And it just really made the difference. What I noticed in the tour was that even though there was an interpreter, and the interpreter was acting for us at the tour, they started discussions about things we had already talked to them about. So when we were sitting in the room where they have their DNA database, a couple of the judges were having almost an argument about what they could do to grow their database. Would it really require a new law, a new statute to grow their database, or could they do it at their level pursuant to some court rules? And so having them there, actually seeing it, they were starting to discuss the thing that we said they needed to advance. They needed to grow their database. Their database has 5,000 people in it. So they're not going to get a lot of hits. It's only been around for about 1.5 years, and it needs to develop. And they were already talking about ways to legally do that. So I think the tour was good. And you may want to ask Gregg about going to see their bug expert.
Yeah, the entomologist. That sounds like an interesting story.
Well, I kind of broke off the main group with the lab director and got to see some other parts of the laboratory. And what's interesting, in different countries, there's a different focus sometimes. For example, in Ukraine, the largest portion of the laboratory was vodka testing laboratory because of fake vodka, that there are people making fake vodka. The largest part of the Abu Dhabi lab was camel blood testing for drugs because they have racing camels in Abu Dhabi, and so that's a very popular sport. Well, one of the largest things that was done here was forensic entomology, which is the analysis of insects. And they had a very big unit for that because they have microenvironments all around Costa Rica that are unique and have unique species. They said there's about 5% of the world's species are in Costa Rica, which is a huge amount of species for such a small country. So they had experts in entomology, and they said that their bodies move around a lot. So they're killed in one place and transported to another. And they're able to tell pretty much the region and down to a window of about 2 hours based on fly larvae of where the body was murdered and the location and timing of that murder. And so they play a big role in that. That's something we don't do here very much. I mean, we have those capabilities if we need them, but they're just not used. Here in Costa Rica, they have enough murders and enough transportation of the bodies around the country that they actually need that expertise, and it was really interesting. They had one fly on the wall that was about that big.
Oh my God.
And then they had several collections of flies that they could rely on from different regions and microenvironments throughout the country. So that was very interesting.
So then those insects become investigators for them.
Yeah, and they culture them in cabinets. They had special cabinets where they collect the maggots from the bodies and they bring the flies up to adulthood, and then they can tell which genus, which species, and then what location and timing the body would have been killed in.
Wow, that's fascinating. I did not know that.
It's interesting.
What are the challenges in Costa Rica? Everybody thinks it's a beautiful place and everything's sort of easy things are easy to do and get around there.
Well, same challenges that we face here. You know, unreported sex assaults. There's a lot of sex assaults there that go unreported. But the reported ones, a lot of them go unsolved. And so that's an issue that they're working on. The homicide rate, again, like I say, they've started to get a handle on it. They've started to see the impact of these databases that we're talking about, but they're years out from having the kind of success that we've had. But those are the challenges. And you know what I thought was really important was they took great pride in their country. They took great pride in what they do and doing it right. And that's why they were so receptive to what we had to say. And I think that they want to make Costa Rica as safe a place as it can be, both for their families but also for people that come and visit there. It's one of their main industries is tourism. There's an awful lot of Americans that retire down there, that actually live down there. We met a young man who was a friend of the judge who had been a surfer down there for years and now has a tourist business and was becoming a citizen. So there's a lot of tie to Colorado. There's a lot of tie to the United States. And I think they really care that their country is a safe place.
It sounds like a fascinating trip, and we'll have to do a whole other show just on how bugs can be part of the investigation.
There's people around for that, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, that's all the time we have for tonight. Thanks to Gregg LaBerge and Mitch Morrissey. We'll see you again next time on Dialogue Denver DA. I'm Tamara Banks.
Denver 8 TV, your city, your source.